lords, ladies, and gentlemen, welcome. So, we're going to continue with our ongoing discussion about distorted thinking. And so we're going to do one segment now about one. We're going to do another one following this one, which will be a separate video. But the reason why I wanted to talk about these just in brief is because I think there are areas where we can get stuck. And especially some of these, I think, are areas where sometimes people on the left can get stuck a lot. All right? So the one I want to talk about first and foremost, and if you want to know more about distorted thinking, please feel free to check in the playlist for that. There's a distorted thinking playlist. We've covered already polarized thinking. We've talked about control fallacies and catastrophizing. So if there's anything that you feel like you're going to need help with, I would look into those videos. Okay? So let's move on to the next one, which is going to be overgeneralization. Oop. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So this is the list we're working from because this is about the universal list I've seen of these. And overgeneralization is defined as this: you come to a general conclusion based on a single incident or piece of evidence. If something bad happens, once you expect it to happen, excuse me, can't talk today. If something bad happens, once you expect it, it'll happen over and over again. Fair. Don't like how that's written. That could have been better. So when we're talking about overgeneralization, what we're really talking about is this idea that human beings are naturally meaning-making animals. What we do is we construct meaning out of the data points that are presented. And the problem is that often it's based on very limited data. I'll give you an example. So if you're online and somebody posts a random kind of shitty thought, right? Just some kind of random fucking whatever. I don't know, a fucking kind of crappy or kind of, shitty meme. There's two ways you might engage with that. One of them is you might consider that this is just them being a little bit edgy and move on, or you may in fact believe that that is the whole of who they are. I actually think overgeneralization is one of the major ways that Facebook and Twitter arguments happen. There's this thing we do where by seeing a data point, a significant singular data point about a person's behavior, we have a tendency to believe that that is the whole of the person. And the problem with this thinking is that in a lot of cases, this can actually get us into a lot of trouble because it will occasionally push us to write people off who may actually be salvageable or someone we can work with. Or we may make an assessment about something based on very quick judgments that we may regret in a further case, right? So we may decide that, okay, that's how that thing is, and we're going to move on. A lot of people do this with political views. A lot of folks will do this thing where they will come to a conclusion based on very little data. We talked about this in the Gestalt therapy video, the video talking about triggers. In that video, there was legitimately a very real discussion around the idea of what's called introjection. And introjection is this idea that you absorb or you take in full without critical thinking the ideals or the narratives of those around you. This can happen with your own thoughts, your own beliefs. It can also happen with your parents. This is why a lot of people who are, if their parents are Republican, there's a pretty good chance they're going to be Republican too, because those beliefs, those ideas are going to be essentially pushed forth to them, interjected to them, but it's not really done in any kind of critical thinking way usually. They just absorb those. There's no real challenging of them. This can happen to overgeneralize a lot of different things. This interjection can happen where we overgeneralize, this is how all of this group is. Now, obviously, there's going to be outliers. We're going to, we can talk about like groups that are like, for example, fascists or neo-Nazis, white supremacists. Those, I would say, while yes, one could make the argument there's an overgeneralization there, I think that's more based on a safety need than distorted thinking. And so I wouldn't say that necessarily falls under this particular issue. The reason why we're covering these things is because what distorted thinking does is it leads us down back roads. Cognitive behavioral therapy would argue that the way we think affects the way we feel, and the way we feel affects our behavior, right? So if you're trying to change a behavior, then you need to get at the root of it and deal with the cognition involved. Now, granted, all problems are not solved this way. There are a lot of things, especially very deep trauma and things like that, that CBT does jack shit for. I'm not saying CBT is the best, despite the 10 years where everyone was going off about how lovely it was. But I think understanding these is really important, because in dialectical behavior therapy, we also talk about these ideas because we look out for them. Because again, same thing. Emotions can be based on faulty thinking. If you can look for these things in yourself, then you can make better judgments, right? Make better discernments about the things around you. Thangor, hello. So we're talking about overgeneralizations, and I'll give you an example that recently happened. Is anyone here familiar with a YouTuber by the name of Riley Grace Rashong? Maybe? So, for those who aren't on Twitter perpetually, Riley Grace Rashong is a trans woman who does discussions around legality and human rights. Does really good work. Really like her research docs. I think they're actually really, really well done. I think she's pretty fucking brilliant. However, RGR has a little bit of a thing that I've talked about in the past. This happened with the Demon Mama debate, and it's something I'm seeing as a reoccurring trend now, where there are these triggers that people seem to show over and over again. You can see this in debates. You watch Demon Mama long enough, you can start noticing patterns. You start looking at Vosh long enough, you start seeing patterns. You start seeing, any content creator you're following, you can start to notice patterns. This can happen with big actors as well. You watch someone like, some big actor that's important right now enough times in different things, even if they play all those characters very differently and very, very well, there's still a way in which there's an overall trend. And that's what we're noticing here, is pattern recognition. And in the case of RGR has a really bad habit, in my opinion, of overgeneralizing. That is, when she gets triggered, that is, she is emotionally upset, she has a hard time stepping away from a situation, and then what happens is she then overgeneralizes against her targets. This happened online recently when I guess RGR had, I wasn't able to find the original part of the thread because it was buried by thousands of retweets and shit like that. My understanding is the whole thing started based on RGR expressing discomfort with the idea of eat the rich, which I don't think anyone's really advocating capitalism there, but it does sort of infer a level of violence. I can't disagree with that. And apparently she got some pushback, and rather than either just dropping it or just kind of trying to find a commonality, it kept going, kept escalating, to the point where apparently she reported that she was getting death threats and harassment, which is fucking garbage. Please don't harass people, for the love of God. But on top of that, she had kind of just decided to dismiss all people who are socialists or communists. And while I can understand a number of LARPers online who pretend they're socialists and communists, who have the big Russian hat, and, this hammer and sickle in their profile and all this other garbage, I can understand being frustrated with those folks, especially the tanky ones that are, authoritarians. But to blanket code entire political movements is a little fucking weird. And that's what this is. This is overgeneralization. Emotional trigger leads to error in thinking. Error in thinking leads to coming to a grand conclusion about a very, very complicated discussion. And the problem is that when we're triggered, we don't want to give up any ground. We don't want to be vulnerable. So what happens is you keep doubling down. I think it's really important to remember these things because I think it can be a big deal whenever we're dealing with observing these situations, right? So for example, one thing I would say is that when we're talking about the RGR situation, I would say that because of the emotional trigger, her thinking got more simplistic, and because she was threatened or felt upset because of the absolute obscene behavior she was receiving, which was absolutely not justified by any stretch of the imagination. These people should have backed down as well. I am in no way justifying harassment, but I do want to say that there is this reoccurring tendency of sort of overgeneralizing the other. This is what happened during the Demon Mama debate as well. The idea that your arguments are the sole ones, I think, created a trigger followed by an overgeneralization of the other person's position. Now, that's not to say Demon Mama didn't make mistakes either. I've talked about this in another video. But I want to point out this in real time because I think it's really important you guys see this. Overgeneralization can be problematic. And the biggest ways I can say that is not with people who are on the other side of the political fence. Those folks I'm not worried about. But like people in your lives, your family, your friends, people online, you know, some guy your aunt knows who's apparently a Trump supporter. Sometimes those people are harmful and we just need to block them. Some people, or sometimes what we need to do is notice if there's sort of assumptions we're coming to, right? As much as I joke that like conservatism is pathology, the reality is that there are people who are conservative that are fairly tolerable to be around. Not saying that them voting for Trump hasn't put people's lives at risk. It absolutely has. But I think that there's an argument to be made here that we don't want to just jump to conclusions because the way I see it, conservatism is a cult. And the goal, from my perspective, would be to pull people out when we're able to. Completely just generalizing and shutting them down leads to nothing good. This is actually one of the reasons why the whole woke scold debate is actually a really big concern for me, is that in the attempts to sort of purity test other people in the left, what essentially ends up happening is that I think we make ourselves look judgmental, lacking in discernment, and self-attacking. And I actually think this prevents people who have been pulled into the alt-right conservative cult from being able to escape, because to leave there would break up all of their communities. They would in some ways cut off all the people they know. And even if they want out, where do they go? Because they'll be cut off from the people they know, and the left won't accept them. Where the fuck do these people go? And while yes, there's a question of safety and how do you vet these people, and are they really like legitimately interested in changing as people? That's a big question. We have to figure that out. We also have to be willing to be vulnerable, because if we always say, no, we're not going to take any risks, that leads to no good outcomes. Literally, it doesn't. It's just cowardice. So I think we have to watch for this even in very, very what seems to be very simplistic political situations. And I think it's also true within our lives. I am notorious in sessions for overgeneralizing sometimes. The reason I do it is actually intentional. A lot of times what I notice is whenever I'm dealing with a kid who has been abused or a trans person who has been kind of gaslit or shut down, one of the things that they do very regularly is they will kind of say something fairly intense. They'll then backtrack on it, realizing that they've kind of like let the cat out of the bag, right? They said the quiet part out loud. And so what I'll do is I'll mirror back to them their anger. They'll let it out just for a second, the anger, the frustration, and then they back it off because it's not safe to do. And so what I do, I'll talk shit about their parent. I'll talk shit about their person they're upset about. I'll talk shit about the transphobes in their life. The reason why I do this is to establish better connections with my clients, because by doing so, by establishing that better connection, I show allyship with them, and I demonstrate what clean anger looks like. So it might be something like this. Your mom really said that? Holy shit. Are you serious? Like that, you do realize that's utterly transphobic, right? Like that's just gross. And what I'm very careful not to do is I don't want them to feel ashamed or hurt because of something their relative or their friend or whoever did what. but I want to point out the bad behavior and try to pull it off of the client. Because in a lot of times, what they'll do is they'll sort of have this background story going that they might, deserve this, right? Or that they're being a burden. We talked about that in the other video. You're being, you as a burden. You're not. Simple as that. Sometimes we're burdensome to each other. There's always factors that can go in there. But this idea of universal or essentialized burdenhood is nonsensical. So is this making sense to everybody? I see the chat's pretty chill tonight. What are people's thoughts on this idea? Does this make sense to you? Do you understand what I'm kind of pointing at? Another way we can describe this is that exact essentialization. It's like the other side of the coin of polarized thinking. Polarized thinking is looking at things in black and white. Overgeneralization is coming to a conclusion based on very few data points. Is that clicking for anybody? Is that making sense? All right, well, I'll wait for chat to make sense to me. Cool. I think it's really important to watch for this stuff. Because another really big place this comes up from is look at the cancellations of Lindsay Ellis and ContraPoints. Think about them what you will, but let's just discuss them. If you look, I've definitely seen people overgeneralizing a lot on Twitter and other places. True. So look at these two situations. We'll take Lindsay, for example, because that's the more recent. Lindsay says something online that could be, if you squinted at it, to use her words, looked at as a microaggression, though nowhere intended there. Although, from what I can tell, no one seems to give a fuck about intentions. And what happens is it goes from Lindsay Ellis might have accidentally done a microaggression to Lindsay Ellis did something racist to Lindsay Ellis is a racist. Do you see how the overgeneralization happens, the essentializing? Rather than look at the scores of videos she's done supporting people of color or people, people who are LGBT, and a lot of the really great discussions there as far as like calling out Disney for their bullshit on Beauty and the Beast for having a gay character, like to not acknowledge her full videography is to in some ways overgeneralize based on this one thing. And then what happens is we can get into this more later, but the essential thing is then we get confirmation bias. Because the problem is that if you're already angry at her, if you're already really concerned and really thinking she's just being an absolute racist, it's really easy then to justify being shitty towards her. It's also really easy to accept other data from other people, which is why the moment this stuff started, scores of other things she did came out. None of them in and of themselves all that particularly problematic. Some of them were kind of shitty, and some of them were things that like dumb people do on the internet. I don't know, whatever. But the thing is that to me that seems really fucked up, because essentially what it's doing is it's taking a particular idea So for 1 sec, I'll finish my thought and then I'll get to that post because I think that's important. It's taking an action, a singular data point of this person did a microaggression or possibly did a microaggression. We can't say for sure. I don't think they did, but that might come down to your individual mileage. And then turning it into this much more overgeneralized notion of this person is this. We've essentialized them. Their whole being, everything they've ever done, all of it is tainted. Everything has become boiled down to this person is a racist. To me, that does two problems. First off, that overgeneralization is just false. And two, it ignores a very simple fact about systemic racism. All of us are racist to some degree against some group. I've never really liked the idea of racism as prejudice plus power, because I've seen groups who are disempowered be prejudiced towards other people. Now, you could make the argument those people still have power in those very, very specific situations. But yeah, I think it's much more complicated than that. Maybe we'll have to get into that in a further stream. Thangor says, I hope you don't mind me asking. I don't. But something I hear often is intent doesn't matter if you're doing harm. Lindsay obviously didn't do anything absurdly harmful, but how does that apply in other situations? I can't say what it is for other people. I can tell you what my two questions are, and we do this in our household. One, I think the projection of maliciousness is often done too quickly. So the question is I ask, what is the intention? Because intention does fucking matter. Full stop. If you're looking at the death of a human being, let's say you drive your car down the street and you accidentally hit somebody, versus go to their house and gun them down, intentionally and premeditatively. We have different terms for those things, right? One of them is murder. The other one is manslaughter. Intention absolutely fucking matters. This is actually where I don't trust these people to make assessments. The sheer audacity of the notion that intention doesn't matter goes against rational thinking. It goes against rehabilitative justice in a nutshell, because the very idea is that you're saying it doesn't matter what the person did, harm was still done. And you're saying that we don't care about what the intent is. That would mean that every single person who's ever accidentally done anything that's led to the death of a human being should what? Receive the death penalty? I mean, are we just assuming it's all murder one then? Like, this is what overgeneralization does, is it ignores context, it ignores nuance for, I honestly think, to some degree, for a very easy outcome. And this is its fucking problem. The second part of that is this. Prove it. Seriously, prove it. Prove to me how there was harm done. I tend to be a little bit of a utilitarian. I like to know what the consequence is. What was the material harm done? Lindsay Ellis put out a tweet that certain South Asian animators got salty about, which that was fine. She had to deal with that consequence. And then a bunch of people, mostly white progressives, jumped on and started attacking. These people weren't hurt, but they performatively still lashed out because they felt it was their duty, because they wanted little online brownie points for being woke. But if you stop and just ask the question, what was the material harm, you see there was actually very little. This is why calling Lindsay Ellis or anyone like that a racist doesn't make sense, because what you're essentially doing is actually devaluing the word racist. Think about that for a second. That's really what's happening. The overgeneralization actually waters down the intention of and truth of that meaning. Someone who is racist is somebody who is either engaging in the perpetuation of systemic racism, such as like Ben Shapiro and his continuous lying, or somebody who's actively, directly interacting with somebody in a prejudiced or aggressive manner. Now, obviously, systemic racism in the form of implicit bias is also a factor as well. But the point being is that if we just look at these simple situations, the idea that these are racist is actually up for debate. And the thing is that, as Lindsay pointed out in her video, depending on who you ask, it either might be, or it is, or it's absolutely not. To say that these things are concretely this is actually, to me, very childish logic. Because at least with some of these things, they're much more nuanced questions and discussions. That's not to say that we shouldn't listen to marginalized people when they feel hurt, upset, or feel like they're being attacked. Do not misunderstand me. I don't want to be clipped out of fucking context. But I want to be clear that if you're going to say to me that someone's actions do harm, this is the same shit that happened with fucking Levy. You're going to say that I'm doing this thing, that I'm backing an abuser, I'm backing this thing. Prove it. Beyond just you making the assertion, the essentialization that I am doing this thing, prove it. Where is the harm? Show me. My video about Lily Orchard covered nothing about her abuses in regards to what Essence of Thoughts video did. So, how can you say that I'm silencing those victims? That's an essentialization based on wanting to moralize. It's an overgeneralization. Rather than saying, hey, this is something you could have done more research on, instead it becomes essentially, you're the bad person, right? So we get into polarized thinking, the other side of overgeneralizing. Is this tracking? Does this make sense to everyone? I know we're talking about some fairly sensitive topics, but I want to be really clear. Like, there's a really good example in ContraPoint's video, canceling. And I like this example because I think it's a really important thing. She mentions that the idea is, she was on it, what was this specific scenario? So, for example, she mentioned that She was on a live stream discussing kink, and one of the topics that came up was DDLG. Not going to go into specifics of that, but DDLG. And one of the things that happened is someone in the chat started losing their shit. They were asked repeatedly to leave and go take care of themselves, and finally they had to block them. Later, Contra after the stream had to do this. This person was yelling and screaming, "How dare you talk about DDLG? That's what my abuser used against me, blah, blah, blah." And the problem is and this is the thing I think was really important. Was Contra participating in a discussion of kink? Yes. Was this person hurt? Yes. Is that Contra's fault? No. This is not intentional harm. This was a discussion of different types of kink, and this person had very real trauma and triggers. Look it up. I'm not going to be use your Google foo. But like the problem is with that is that to say that she's doing harm is actually a gross overgeneralization in that situation, because it's essentially saying that you are, in one way or another, any action that leads to any amount of harm is somehow put onto you. I've actually seen woke scolds say that Contra is in the wrong for that, and they're wrong. They're actually wrong, actively wrong. Did you have something you wanted to add, Zena? You'll need to speak up a little bit.
I'm gonna finish up what you're saying. I was just gonna add in a part about like how to boundary.
You have to speak up, Kisses.
I was gonna add setting boundaries according to what actually happened or what actually the actual consequences were. I think is important. I had an example about that.
Do you want to bring it in now? Because we can bring this in before the segment ends. I do want to get the segment done because we have other things to do. But
yeah.
Zena.
Hi everyone. So Jess has been talking quite a bit about like larger examples, things you can see on the internet. And I think it's also good to bring up examples of like some day-to-day stuff people might be interacting with. And so especially with overgeneralized thinking and making sure to ask those questions, what you said, what was the actual material consequence, right? I think it's important to keep that in mind and use that as you are working with other people or having to interact with family members, right? Let's say you're in a house where somebody forgets to take out the dog, right? Okay,
you're going to want to project a little bit. You want to make sure that when you talk, it's going into the yellow.
Okay, that makes more sense. So let's say somebody forgets to do something, right? Maybe take out the dog. All right, a lot of us have puppers. If that was an intentional, I'm just not doing it, that's one thing, right? Or if this was like a shit, everybody kind of dropped the ball, nobody communicated well, that's another thing, right? And your responses need to be different to that. But you actually still need to engage with people enough to ask those questions of like, why or how did this happen? Because if you're overgeneralizing and just going like, I don't know, you're a bad person because you didn't do this thing, okay? That gets into a whole lot of projection and isn't really useful, isn't really taking into account the entire situation. And I think this is especially important to look at when we're working with kids, right?
There's a really bad habit of projecting on people when they don't do a thing. There's an assumption of intent. And one of the big things I would bring up with that is as well is this happens a lot with parents where they will project onto their kid a level of complex thought that is just functionally impossible for that kid at their age. Like I've heard parents say some downright sort of Machiavellian level conspiracy they think their kids are thinking, and their kid's just like a kid. I feel like I can remember my mom doing that a lot. Fair. Also sorry.
Yeah, especially or like if your kid has a learning disability and you don't understand how to work with them yet, right? Like you got to be real careful not to put any like intent or overgeneralize, and you really got to be able to dig deep what like specifically is going on because your kid probably doesn't have the language to tell you, right? They're probably just like, I feel this thing, it's happening, okay, and so we got to kind of pull out those things and kind of get a better understanding.
No, I absolutely agree, 100%. So why don't we leave this one here? I think the overgeneralization thing is good. And what I'd like to do is switch gears and move into another segment. So we will end this one here. If you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell. Yeah, if you want to help the stream, you can actually donate to streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. You can also become a patron. Patreon.com/transgirltherapist. So I will see you in the next video. Bye.